Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take a look at the header element in HTML. This video is part of a larger series of videos that focuses on what I'm calling intermediate HTML. And this video out of context will probably seem a little strange, so I encourage you to go back and look at an earlier video where I sort of discussed the purpose of these smaller videos, these smaller demos. And specifically in this video, we're going to take a look at the header element. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some very simple HTML, and I'm going to try to display it in three different ways so that you could sort of start to understand the purpose behind some of these semantic elements, or rather how they are used, but how they don't really affect necessarily the style or the presentation of the content of your page. They're essentially intended to be a little more on the structural side. And unless your web browser has something specifically set up to handle them, you're not going to really notice the difference. Now, again, I'm going to follow this up in several later videos, particularly when we start looking at styling, so that you can see how to combine these structural elements, these semantic elements, along with the style to create some pretty sophisticated web pages, much more sophisticated than just plain HTML. So let's go ahead and get started. You can see here that I am going to be using Visual Studio. Again, you can use whatever IDE you want to, including Notepad. And I'm just going to go ahead and create a new file here, a new HTML page. And what we're going to do is we're just going to start off by including a H1 tag. I'm just going to say something like hello and welcome. Nothing fancy here. And again, the purpose of this is to provide the structure, not so much the style, but as we've seen in our earlier videos, there's sort of an implied style in an H1 tag. And then we're just going to throw in a P tag. Here is some additional text. Again, just something simple. We can make this much more complicated if we want to. All right, so there we go. Just something that we can easily view, easily render. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to save it in a folder that I've created sort of off screen here, that I'm calling intermediate HTML and CSS. It doesn't really matter where you store this. And again, to keep to sort of the very ambiguous and boring naming scheme, I'm just going to call this one header underscore 01. And again, capital or lowercase doesn't really matter. You just can't come up with some pattern that is consistent for you. All right, so we're going to go and save this. And again, if you're using Visual Studio, you can go ahead and use the split view, which, interestingly enough, appears to have stopped working on me for the purposes of this video. That's okay. I'll restart it later on. I'm not going to worry about that right now. And you can see here that here is, again, very simple page. So we have our hello and welcome. Here's some additional text. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to repeat this same process, except this time around, what I'd like to do is I would like to include this header element, this header tag. And you can notice that if I include the header tag, that I pretty much have access to all of the same elements or tags that I would otherwise have if I had put it inside of the body directly. And so you can see here again that we can include an H1. We can also have a P, and for that matter, like I said, most of the ones that we've been using in our earlier videos, tables and text areas and so on. So again, it doesn't really limit us much. And so what we're going to do is we're simply going to copy the two elements that we created earlier, and we're going to paste it inside of our header element. I'm going to go ahead and save it, and then I'm going to go back over to our browser, and I'm simply going to go ahead and refresh it. And you can see that you essentially can't tell the difference between the two of them. As a matter of fact, the only way that I really can is if I come along and go ahead and inspect the element, or if I look at the code behind. I'm going to go ahead and just use the inspection tool here because it's pretty easy to see. There's only a few lines here, but you can see that essentially your browser is going to render these the exact same way. Now, if you've been working a little bit with your cascading style sheets, all sorts of ideas and lights should have went off in your head at this point. In other words, basically what we can do is we can style the header differently than the rest of the body of the page. And so hopefully you can start to get a little bit of an idea or an insight into how you could go about leveraging this additional semantic tag for the purposes not only of structuring your page, but later on also styling your page. Because again, by default, there's not going to be a lot of difference between how a header tag and text or tags inside the body are going to be presented to the user. There's a second thing to consider, though. Again, we'll cover it in a later video, but I've already mentioned it once, is imagine if you could come up with a tool to automatically parse your HTML page using, for instance, something like regular expressions. In other words, if you knew there was a open header and a close header tag on a page, and you simply ran the contents of that page through a regular expression, you could automatically pull out the contents inside of the header tag. And again, hopefully some lights have went off in your head, and you can imagine all of the different possibilities, including being able to create separate applications that could pull from your web page specific pieces of information. And now you can sort of get an idea of where we're going with these semantic tags. And again, before I finish this one off here, I do want to go ahead and include one more example here from the HTML header tag, although we will follow it up later on, and that is the idea of this article tag. Now, you saw it in an earlier video and we talked about it, and again, I'll come back around to this article tag later on, but what we can do is we can actually include an additional element. In other words, sort of think of it like a hierarchy inside of our body. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to start with a article tag first. And then what we're going to do is we're going to bury inside of the article the header with the H1 and the P tags. And just to go ahead and emphasize what we're going to do here is I'm actually going to go ahead and copy this entire set of elements twice. Go ahead and save this one more time. And if we go back over to our web browser and then simply refresh our page, you'll notice that, again, you can't really see the difference between all of these different versions of our hello and welcome. And again, unless your browser has something specific set up to identify an article or a header tag and to style it differently, that is somewhat intentional. Again, these are semantic tags. They have an implied structure, an implied meaning. Like I said, I explained it in an earlier video. I use the term implied here because there is a little bit of ambiguity in there. But what we're going to do is we're going to use that to our advantage. So what do I encourage you to do is I encourage you with playing around with these articles, including adding some IDs, even some class attributes to these article elements, as well as these header elements. And then see if you can actually combine that with what you know already of your style to create a style for a specific type of element. So in other words, you style an article a certain way, you style a header a certain way, and then so on. And then you can test it against the non-wrapped H1 and P tags just to see if you can sort of visually differentiate between the elements in your page. So again, go back here to our source. I haven't included the title in this. I should probably not be too lazy here, so we'll go ahead and include here. This is going to be our header _ 01. But at this point, that's pretty much all I've got for this particular video. The key to focus on here is that the header tag, as well as the article tag that we'll talk about later on, really doesn't impact much as far as the viewing of your page. It's more about the structure and then what we can do with it later on. And then hopefully in the next video, I'll figure out what in the world happened with my design and my split view so that we can actually see this inside of Visual Studio. As always, hope you enjoyed watching. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me.